In the last episode of this series, we learned that either way, Herb Thomas would claim the championship and it would be in dominating fashion. But in this timeline, it would only have been his first. So today in this episode, we're going to break down the 1954 season and what could possibly happen. In 1954, we would have 11 full-time drivers, over double from 1953. Defending champion Herb Thomas, Herschel McGriff, Dick Rathman, Laird Bruner, Dave Terrell, Buck Baker, Lee Petty, Joe Eubanks, Blackie Pitt, Jim Pascal, and Ralph LaGlory. In the opening 7 races, we would have 3 full-time winners. Defending champion Herb Thomas would win 3 of the first 4 races, winning the season opener at West Palm Beach and then winning races 3 and 4 at Jacksonville and Atlanta. Dick Rathman would win race 6 at Oakland and then the next week at North Wilkesboro, and Lee Petty would win race 2 at Daytona Beach. So after 7 races, the 1949 and 50 champion Lee Petty was at the top of the standings by a very thin margin over Buck Baker. At Hillsboro, Baker would finish 3rd while Petty would finish 6th, and this would hand Baker the point lead by 8 points. At Macon, Baker would finish 8th and Petty 9th, extending the gap to 17 points. At Langhorne, Baker would finish 6th and Petty 9th, growing the gap to 24 points. At Wilson, Baker would dominate and win while Petty would finish 4th, and the gap was now 49 points. At Martinsville, Petty would finish 2nd, while Baker would come home 18th, and this would hand the point lead back to Petty by just 12 points. At Sharon, Lee Petty would win while Baker would finish 2nd, and grew the gap to 22 points. At Raleigh, Petty would finish 4th while Baker would finish 9th. After 14 races, it seemed to be a showdown between the 2-time champion of Lee Petty and Buck Baker. At Charlotte, Buck Baker would dominate and take the win while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap was now 24 points. Fast forward 2 races to Columbia, and Lee Petty would finish 5th and Baker finished 8th, and grew the gap to 37 points. At the Linden Airport, Buck Baker would finish 3rd and Petty would finish 10th, and the gap was only 1 point with Petty in the lead and Baker in 2nd. At Hickory, Petty would finish 2nd and Baker finished 3rd, slightly extending the gap to 6 points. At Rochester, Petty would win while Baker would finish 4th and grow the gap to 26 points. At Mechanicsburg, Baker would finish 6th and Petty would finish 7th, and with 16 races to go, we would have a tight championship battle. At Spartanburg, Petty would finish 3rd and Baker finished 4th, slightly increasing the gap to 27 points. At Weaverville, Petty would finish 4th while Baker finished a mediocre 14th and grew the gap to 66 points. Fast forward 2 races to the Grand Rapids, Lee Petty would win the race while Baker finished 2nd, grew the gap to 76 points. At Morristown, Buck Baker would have a bounce-back race and win while Petty would finish 6th and shrink the gap to 46 points. Skipping 2 races ahead to Charlotte, Lee Petty would answer with a win while Baker would finish 4th. And now, with 9 races to go, the championship battle was heating up, and now it would be a question of would it be the 2-time champion of Lee Petty or would it be Buck Baker. At San Mateo, Buck Baker's championship bid would get off to a not-so-great start with a 17th place finish, while Petty would finish 5th and now the gap was 104 points. At Corbin, Petty would strengthen his chances with a win while Buck Baker would finish 3rd, and now the gap was 119 points. At the Southern 500, both drivers would have horrible races with Baker finishing 44th and Petty finishing 38th, and the gap grew to 126 points. At Macon, Buck Baker's chances at the crown would essentially end with a 21st place finish, while Petty went on to finish 3rd, and the gap was now over a race's worth of points at 191. At Charlotte, Petty would outrun Baker again with a 2nd place finish, and the gap grew to 196 points. At Langhorne, Petty would finish 2nd and Baker in 4th, and the gap once again grew to 206 points. At Lehigh, Buck Baker would stop the bleeding with a win, while Petty finishing 3rd, and the gap slightly shrunk to 201 points. Going into the penultimate race of the season, Petty could lock up the championship a race early. All he had to do was finish 22nd, but in the penultimate race at Martinsville, Petty would win the race to put the exclamation point on the season and lock up the championship a race early. In 1954, Lee Petty would take home the title either way, but in this timeline, he would claim his 3rd championship after taking the inaugural season in 1949 away from Red Byron and 1950 away from Bill Rexford. In 1954, Buck Baker would put up a hell of a fight, but when it came down to it, he would crack under the pressure while Petty would thrive and take home his third crown in 6 years. Well, that'll do it again for today. Thanks for watching. In case you haven't noticed, there is now a join button on the channel. This is optional, and if you don't want to, that's completely fine. You guys watching these videos and subscribing helps me out enough. So thank you, and I will see you next week for 1955.